John Axon was an English train driver who was born on the 4th of December 1900 in Stockport, Cheshire. Originally, he worked as an apprentice painter and decorator, but in 1919 he joined the London and North Western Railway as a cleaner, and eventually becoming a fireman. Then in 1921, he was an engine driver, and he served with the London, Midland and Scottish Railway from 1923 after the grouping. And after 1948, he would continue in that role under British Railways. John was a highly experienced train driver. He'd been working on the rails for most of his life, and that wealth of knowledge when it came to locomotive operation would be put to the test on the 9th of February, 1957. On that day, he was on an outward trip from Stockport to Buxton. He was driving a Stanier Class 8F 280, number 48188. We've talked about the 8Fs before. They were incredibly good locomotives, the freight version of the Black 5. The train consisted of 33 wagons as well as a brake van on the rear. During the trip, Axon had noticed that there was a leak from the supply to the locomotive's steam brake, and at Buxton, he requested that it receive fitters' attention so they could make a temporary repair. Unfortunately, on the return trip back to Stockport, the repair didn't hold, and the steam pipe broke away from the steam brake and disabled the locomotive's brakes entirely, as well as the whistle. The damage was such that it filled the locomotive's cab with scalding steam, and it made it incredibly difficult for Axon or his fireman, Ron Scanlon, from reaching the controls to the engine. Back then, radios were not equipped on British rail locomotives. The crews in the front and the rear of any train would still use the whistle to communicate, as they had done over the last century. But even if they could get through the steam to get to the whistle, it wasn't working. At the time, they were headed up a steep bank, and there was a banking engine pushing from behind. The crew on that locomotive had no idea what was going on in the front of the train. Axon and Scanlon managed to partially close the regulator for the locomotive, as well as screw down the engine's tender brakes, but this didn't help at all. And they knew if they reached the top of the grade and started heading down the other side, there's no way they'd get the train to stop. The train wasn't going particularly fast, at least at that point, so Axon told Scanlon to jump off and attempt to apply some of the wagon brakes of the loose-coupled train. Scanlon managed to apply a few, but it still wasn't enough to stop the train from reaching the summit, and from there, the train began accelerating down the 1:58 gradient towards Chapel and the Frith. The crew of the banking engine was horrified to see the rest of the train accelerate away from them, and the guard in the rear of the train tried desperately to apply the brakes in his van, but at that point there was nothing they could do. At the time of the failure, John Axon could have jumped. He could have saved himself along with his firemen. It was going slow enough that at worst he probably only would have suffered minor injuries. But Axon didn't do that. In an act that's eerily reminiscent of the legendary Casey Jones, Axon chose to stay with his engine and ride out the runaway train, hoping there was something he could do to at least alert people to get out of the way of a train that he had no way of stopping. Despite the continuing stream of scalding steam on the footplate, Axon remained alert, and he managed to wave a warning to the signalman at Dove Holes. This act actually enabled a DMU that was at Chapel and the Frith station to be moved out of the way, but they couldn't warn the crew of a passing Roseley to Stockport freight service. They were going way too slow to outrun Axon's train, and 48188 slammed into the rear of that freight train. This sent multiple cars sailing off the line and derailed 48188. The brake van had been destroyed, and the accident killed John Creamer, who was the other freight train's guard, as well as driver John Axon himself. A nearby signalman barely escaped as 48188's tender actually sideswiped his signal box. As sad as that day was, the fact is, it could have been much worse, were it not for John Axon's actions that day. By remaining with the locomotive, he was able to alert people down the line of the emergency, and therefore minimize the damage overall. For this effort, he was awarded the George Cross on the 7th of May, 1957. His cross was eventually donated to the National Railway Museum in York in 1978. He was also awarded the Order of Industrial Heroism by the Daily Herald. He left behind a wife and 2 sons. He was the subject of a 1957 radio ballad known as The Ballad of John Axon that was written by Ewan McCall and Peggy Seeger, as well as being produced by Charles Parker. On the 19th of February 1981, a British Rail Class 86, number 86261, was named Driver John Axon, GC, at a ceremony held at Euston Station in London. In February 2007, a DMU Class 150, number 150273, was also named Driver John Axon, GC, at Buxton. That nameplate was actually passed on to a Class 156 DMU, 156460, and a plaque that commemorates the events was later unveiled and mounted at Chapel on the Frith Station. So like many of the heroes we talk about, John Axon should continue to be remembered, not just for his sacrifice, but for the lives he saved while doing so. Wally Oakes was born on the 23rd of April in 1932, and he was a train driver in the UK who worked for, yes, British Railways. Look, we're not focusing on that today. This is about Wally, not about his employers. We'll talk about them probably tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. There's no escape for me. We go over this a lot. The date of the accident was the 5th of June, 1965, and he was the driver that was in charge of a relief train that was on its way from Crewe to Carlisle with a load of passengers. His locomotive that day was number 70051, Firth of Forth, which was a BR Standard Class 7. The Class 7s were 462 Pacific types and designed by Robert Riddles for use by British Railways for mixed traffic. 55 of them were built in total between 1951 and 1954. You may recognize 1965 as being well into British Railways' modernization plan, and the Class 7s were definitely on the way out, with some reasoning. They were always a really iffy class. Crews liked them for the most part, but especially in the early days they had a lot of problems keeping to timetables, partially because their driving wheels actually shifted on their axles. Many modifications were applied to them to ease their problems, and to be fair, by 1965 they were doing alright, but on that day something did go wrong. As Firth of Forth traveled down the line, she suffered a sudden blowback in her firebox. This filled the cab with smoke and flames, engulfing both Wally Oakes and his fireman, Willem Roberts. Roberts managed to get out of the cab window and extinguish his clothing by rubbing against the plating of the locomotive. But Oakes, despite being surrounded by literal fire, knew that if he abandoned the locomotive now, his passengers would be in extreme danger, with no one at the controls of the locomotive. He stayed at his post long enough to close the regulator, open the blower, and then apply the brakes, bringing the train to a stop. Once the train stopped, Roberts found Oakes lying on an embankment next to the train, and he was in terrible shape. He hadn't actually left the locomotive until it came to a stop, and had burns to approximately 80% of his body. Emergency services arrived and took him to a hospital, and his pain was so bad that he had to be suspended above his hospital bed and given large doses of morphine. Despite the doctor's best efforts, a week after the accident, he would pass away from his injuries. But Wally would be hailed as a hero. His actions had saved the rest of the passengers on board the train that day, who may have been involved in a severe accident if he had allowed the engine to continue as it was. On the 19th of October 1965, he was posthumously awarded the George Cross, the highest award bestowed by the British government for non-operational gallantry or gallantry not in the presence of an enemy. And then in February of 1966, he was also posthumously awarded a Bronze Carnegie Hero Medal and is considered the only railwayman ever to receive that award. Oakes wound up buried in an unmarked grave in St. Matthew's Church in Haslington, Cheshire. But years after the incident, on the 1st of February 2018, a headstone was finally put in place that was dedicated to him. It had been paid for by a group of railwaymen and donors as a result of an appeal that was launched by Heritage Railway magazine. British Rail also honored Wally in their own way. On the 19th of February 1981, a Class 86 electric locomotive, number 86260, was named Driver Wallace Oakes, GC. A memorial plaque in the offices above Crewe Station also reads, in commemoration of driver W.A. Oakes, aged 33 years, who through devotion to duty received fatal burns at Winsford whilst working the 2/5 p.m. express crew to Carlisle engine number 70051. Date 5th of June, 1965, from his fellow workmates, Crew Motive Power Department. And in September of 2017, the National Railway Museum purchased Oakes' George Cross at an auction for £60,000, and it's currently on display in the museum. And what an absolute legend. I mean, it's one thing to risk your life for somebody else, but to do it while you're currently on fire, that takes significant dedication. And I hope Wally continues to get the recognition he deserves in the years to come. Soham is a small town and civil parish, actually, in Cambridgeshire, England, and by extension the United Kingdom. And much like many places in the United Kingdom in 1944, where our story takes place, things were rough. It was a time of very thick fighting during World War II, and the railroads in particular were working overtime. On the 2nd of June of that year, there was a particular train that left Whitemoor Marshalling Yard at 12:15 a.m. On board the train was 41-year-old driver Benjamin Gimbert, 22-year-old fireman James Nightall, and a train guard by the name of Herbert Clark. The locomotive pulling the train was a WD Austerity 280, engine number 7337. The Austerities were an interesting type of locomotive, and you may be wondering what the WD is for. Well, that stands for War Department. Similarly to the USATC S-160 class that we built in America, the Austerities were built specifically by the War Department because they needed more locomotives for the war effort. Also, like the S-160s, they were designed for quick assembly, not necessarily longevity. And they built an insane amount of them, 935 in total, making it one of the most produced classes of British steam locomotive ever. They were nicknamed Aussies by the railwaymen. Despite their prevalence and being exported to several places, only one wound up being preserved, number 9733. Anyway, I got way off track. Back to 1944 in Soham, 7337 was pulling a very large train for that era, totaling 51 wagons as well as a brake van, and they were heading for Ipswich. The cargo of this particular train is very relevant to the topic. Out of the 51 wagons, 44 of them contained a total weight of 400 tons of bombs. The remaining 7 contained other components for the war effort, such as tail fins for airplanes. If it wasn't obvious, the crew, driver Benjamin, fireman James, and guard Herbert, were well aware that their train was relatively explosive, but for that time, this was a very normal practice. It was the easiest way to get munitions across the United Kingdom quickly, and it was much safer than going by road. However, as you might have expected, things did not go according to plan on this day. 90 minutes into the trip, as the train was approaching Soham Station, Benjamin glanced back to see flames coming from the leading wagon right behind the locomotive. This specific wagon contained precisely 44 general-purpose 500-pound bombs. Benjamin was well aware of this fact and immediately applied the brakes and brought the train to a halt. Now, Benjamin Gimbert had a couple options here, and as the driver, he could have made the call to just run. He knew they were hauling bombs, he knew there was a fire, and he knew there was no way they could possibly get it out in time. There was an explosion that was going to happen. But Benjamin didn't do this. Rather than running to safety, he instructed his fireman James Nightall to uncouple the first wagon from the rest of the train. The rest of the train that is carrying more bombs, lest you have forgotten. Nightall didn't skip a beat on this and quickly accomplished this task, even though the fire by that point had almost completely consumed the wagon. Gimbert then began to pull the decoupled wagon away from the rest of the train. He actually managed to pull it a decent distance, 140 yards or 128 meters, and was actually alongside the platforms at Soham Station when the bombs finally went off. The explosion left the wagon, as well as the locomotive, in absolute tatters. But due to Gimbert and Nightall's actions, a much more severe explosion was avoided. The rest of the train was left standing, untouched. Sadly though, the blast had killed James Nightall, the fireman, instantly. A signalman, Frank Bridges, was actually on one of the platforms near the train at the time, and he would die the following day of his injuries. Incredibly, the driver, Benjamin Gimbert, whose quick thinking had averted a greater disaster, actually survived. He was very badly injured, but he would live. The guard, Herbert Clark, had been stunned by the blast and was suffering from mild shock. But despite his condition, he managed to walk to the next signal box and warn the signalman there about what had happened. The blast, despite not being as bad as it could have been, still managed to damage some of the surrounding area. 5 more people suffered severe injuries, and another 22 minor injuries. In the spot where the wagon had been, a crater that was 66 feet, or 20.1 meters in diameter, and 15 feet, or 4.6 meters, deep, was all that remained. The station's buildings were also very badly damaged, and over 700 properties nearby the station also suffered significant damage ranging from moderate to severe. It was a silver lining that they were in the middle of World War II at the time. Because they had already expected and planned for possible bomb drops on their rail lines, the emergency repairs on the damaged track actually took place incredibly fast. Freight traffic resumed in the area within 18 hours, and passenger traffic resumed the next day. Locomotive 7337 was very badly damaged, but again, it was also repaired and returned to service. It actually wound up surviving to 1967 and served on the Longmoor Military Railway in Hampshire, before she was sadly scrapped. An investigation did take place into what caused the accident. How did that fire even start? Well, to this day, there really isn't a solid explanation. They never could figure out for certain exactly what had happened, but the running theory is that the wagon itself may have been to blame. Prior to being used as a part of that munitions train, the wagon had been used to carry a load of bulk sulfur powder. And even though the wagon was supposed to be clean in between being used for the sulfur and being used for the munitions train, the investigation entertained the possibility that perhaps it wasn't done as thoroughly as it should have been, and that some of the powder still remained when it was loaded with the bombs. They did lay a sheet between the wagon and the bomb load, but it is still believed that what happened was that a cinder from the locomotive managed to land in the wagon and ignited some of the sulfur that remained. This larger flame managed to therefore catch the wooden wagon on fire, thus leading to the blast. Again, it's never been proven this is exactly what happened, but it was the best theory anybody had. However, as the investigation concluded, what was known for certain is that had it not been for the actions of Benjamin Gimbert and James Nightall, the explosion would have been much more severe and likely killed many people. Both men were awarded the George Cross, which is the highest possible award bestowed by the British government for non-operational gallantry or gallantry not in the presence of an enemy. The exact requirements for the reward read as for acts of the greatest heroism or for most conspicuous courage in the circumstance of extreme danger. In this case, I believe it was both. And as I said, Mr. Gimbert was alive to receive his award, and sadly James Nightall had to be awarded it posthumously. The citation for the awards conclude as follows. Gimbert and Nightall were fully aware of the contents of the wagon which was on fire, and displayed outstanding courage and resource in endeavoring to isolate it. When they discovered that the wagon was on fire, they could easily have left the train and sought shelter. But realizing that if they did not remove the burning vehicle, the hull of the train, which consisted of 51 wagons of explosives, would have blown up, they risked their lives in order to minimize the effect of the fire. There is no doubt that if the whole train had been involved, as it would have but for the gallant action of the men concerned, there would have been serious loss of life and property. Their actions that day are nothing short of heroic, and God rest James Nightall's soul. The guy was 22 years old, younger than me, and he was still willing to put his life on the line to protect those around him. Since that time, in many ways the incident has been the stuff of legend when it comes to UK rail history. A permanent memorial was unveiled on the 2nd of June in 2007 by Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester. No, not that one, but that one, thank you. And it was followed by a service at St. Andrew's Church in Soham. And the men involved have also been honored in other ways. Both Gimbert and Nightall had Class 47 locomotives named after them. Number 47577 for Benjamin Gimbert, and number 47579 for James Nightall. Benjamin's nameplate would eventually be transferred to 47574 in July of 1987, and then much later in 2004, it would be transferred to a Class 66, number 66077. Interestingly, Nightall's Class 47 actually wound up in preservation and retained his name, despite the fact that his original nameplate was also transferred to a Class 66. So there's actually 2 locomotives bearing his name, and I think it's definitely deserved. Both Benjamin Gimbert and James Nightall are heroes of the rails in my book. Jesús García Corona, sometimes simply called Jesús García, was born on the 13th of November in 1881 in Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico, as one of 8 children. When he was 17, he got a job with the Moctezuma Copper Company, but because of his age, he was only made a water boy at the time. Eventually, he'd be promoted to a switchman, then to a brakeman, and eventually a fireman. Though according to all sources at the time of the incident, he was acting as a brakeman for a train that was operating between Douglas, Arizona, and a mining town known as Placeritos de Nacazori. Jesus was actually on break sitting nearby the idling locomotive when he noticed a large amount of smoke in the air. Jesus saw that sparks from the locomotive's smokestack had blown back onto the first cars of the train, which ignited the hay that was on top of it. Under normal circumstances, this would have meant getting the fire brigade out and dousing the flames before they could spread to the whole train. The problem was that Jesus was well aware that the train that day was transporting 70 boxes of dynamite. To make matters worse, the train was idling in the yard, in spitting distance of the town, and the yard was also the place they stored other things for mining operations, like gas tanks and even more dynamite. He had a couple of options here. He could have just warned everyone and run away, which no one would have blamed him for necessarily, but Jesus didn't do that. Instead, he dashed the locomotive and threw it into reverse at full steam, down a grade, in an effort to get the train as far away from people as possible. Some speculate he may have planned to halt the train at a certain point when he felt it was far enough away, and then abandon it himself, but unfortunately he would never get the chance to do so. He made it about 4 miles away from the town when the explosives went off. Witnesses say that the shower of debris continued to pelt the ground for several minutes after the blast, and a total of 13 people died in the accident, but that's a pittance compared to what would have happened had that train detonated while it was still in the yard. It's entirely likely that the entire town would have been leveled, and who knows how many would have been killed. For reference, there were at least 5,000 people who lived in the town at that time. Jesus was, and still is, revered as a national hero. Many places across Mexico are named after him to this day, and the citizens of the city he saved opted to rename it to Nacozari de Garcia, after him. There are several monuments to him around Mexico, and his heroism is also recounted in a ballad, Jesús García, which was sung by Arizona State's official balladeer, Dolan Ellis, who, in his own words, wanted the world to know about the Casey Jones of Mexico. Casey Jones is arguably the most famous engineer and hero of the rails in American history, but Jesus definitely has that title for Mexico. What he did is nothing short of incredible and selfless at just 25 years old, and he was also posthumously awarded the American Cross of Honor for what he did. So let's all raise a glass to Jesus Garcia Corona, a true hero of the rails. Catherine Carroll Shelley, generally only referred to as Kate, was not born in America, but spent most of her life there. She was one of 5 children belonging to one Michael and Margaret Shelley, who married on February 24, 1863. While her father Michael was likely originally a tenant farmer in Ireland, the family moved to the United States when Kate was just 1.5 years old. At first they actually lived with relatives near Freeport, Illinois, but then they built their own home on about 163 acres near Honey Creek, which was a tributary stream of water to the Des Moines River in Boone County, Iowa. The land was allegedly not very good for farming, but their home was built extremely close to lines owned by the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. Michael Shelley became a foreman of a section gang, and worked that job to support his family until he sadly died of tuberculosis in 1878. Their father's death was only shortly after her youngest brother drowned at the age of 10. Kate was only 12 when all this was happening, and she was forced to step up and help work the meager farm that the family owned. Her mother's health was also declining, so in many ways she became the head of her household at such a young age. Their lives persisted this way until the afternoon of July 6, 1881. Thunderstorms had moved into the area, and the heavy rains that came with them caused a flash flood of Honey Creek, which caused a washout of some of the timbers that supported the Honey Creek Bridge for the train tracks nearby. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway was well aware of the possible damage that such heavy rains could cause, so in order to be safe they sent out a pusher locomotive to check the line and ensure everything was clear. The locomotive had a crew of 4, Edgar Wood, A.P. Olmsted, Adam Agar, and Patrick Donahue. Unfortunately, the crew did not see that the washout had caused damage to the Honey Creek Bridge. It was dark by this point, 11 p.m. at night, and the locomotive fell through the bridge, taking all 4 of her crew with her. Kate had been awake at the time, and as she later recalled herself, she said there came the horrible crash and the fierce hissing of steam. Kate, who was then only 17 years old, took it upon herself to leave her home in the middle of the raging storm and check to see if there was any way she could help. She was only wearing an old dress and a tattered overcoat, and she ran towards the Honey Creek Bridge and then saw that 2 of the men that had been on board the locomotive were still alive, clinging to branches in the raging waters. Edgar Wood and Adam Agar held on tightly, but were not able to swim to shore due to the strength of the current. The men were too far away from shore for Kate to get to them herself. She needed assistance. But on top of that, and much more alarmingly, Kate knew that another train was due quite soon. She had lived by the tracks long enough to know that an eastbound express passenger train was due to come through the area around midnight, If the station wasn't warned about the bridge, that express was in extreme danger. Due to the position of her home, she was already on the side of Honey Creek she needed to be on, but she still needed to get across the Des Moines River Bridge, which was much larger, and sat about 30 feet off the ground. The bridge had also been designed to discourage pedestrians from ever attempting to use it to cross due to safety concerns. Some of the boards in between the railroad ties were no longer there. It was not so easy to simply walk over the bridge. With the storm raging, rain pouring, and the wind buffeting her with every movement she made, Kate had to crawl on her hands and knees to stabilize herself in between each of the railroad ties as she crossed the bridge. Splinters cut at her skin, the wood ripped at her clothing, but she was able to make it across the bridge and reach Wangona, Iowa's station before she collapsed from exhaustion. She was only unconscious a short time, but during that time, the station master, who had known her father, recognized her and managed to do the math on his own. Between Kate's condition and presence at the station, the missing work crew, and the raging storm, he immediately halted the express that was still on the way. When Kate regained consciousness, she informed everyone about the two men that were still clinging for dear life in Honey Creek, and she returned with a rescue party to help. Edgar Wood would be retrieved first. He managed to hold onto a rope that was tossed to him and was pulled to safety. Adam Agar was a bit more difficult, and they were actually unable to reach him until the water receded somewhat, but he would also survive. Sadly, the other two crew members were not so lucky. Patrick Donahue's body was found at a cornfield about a quarter mile downstream from the bridge, and A.P. Olmsted was never found at all. But Kate had still accomplished something amazing. Not only had the two survivors been rescued, but the express was halted at Scranton, and it had about 200 people on board. Had that train gone into the creek, there's no telling how many could have been hurt or killed. The story of Kate's heroism quickly spread about Iowa, and eventually even made international news. Reporters from all around the United States came to interview her, but the ordeal had been incredibly taxing. She was bedridden for 3 months after the incident. Still, her heroism had made her somewhat of a local celebrity, and people flocked to thank her for what she had done. The passengers who'd been saved from a terrible accident started a monetary collection for Kate. Additionally, she received 2 different medals, one from the state of Iowa that had been crafted by Tiffany & Company. The state also gave her $200, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in today's money, that'd be nearly $6,000. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway also awarded her $100, or nearly $3,000 in today's money, a half barrel of flour, half a load of coal, and a lifetime pass to travel on the railway whenever she wanted. The Order of Railway Conductors also gave her a gold watch and chain. People nationwide latched on to Kate's story. Poems and songs were composed for her. When the Chicago and Northwestern Railway built a new steel bridge in 1901, they actually named it the Boone Viaduct, but locals quickly started just calling it the Kate Shelley Bridge, or Kate Shelley High Bridge. The informal name stuck, and it was considered the first bridge in the country that was named after a woman. Much later, between 2006 and 2009, Union Pacific built a second viaduct alongside the old one. Designed to accommodate heavier trains, it has 2 tracks and can handle 2 trains simultaneously at a speed of 70 miles per hour. When it was opened on October 1st in 2009, it was officially known as the new Kate Shelley Bridge, and is actually one of North America's tallest double-track railroad bridges. Kate had a lot of opportunities come towards her later in life. Frances E. Willard, who was a reformer and temperance leader, actually wrote to one of Kate's friends, Isabella Parks, who was the wife of the president of Simpson College at Indianola, and offered $25 toward an advanced education for Kate. Kate did attend a term of college between 1883 and 84, but she did not return for the following term because she missed being with her family. She seemed to prefer the simple family life, and with her mother's ill health and younger siblings, she couldn't bring herself to abandon them for her sake. In 1890, the Chicago Tribune actually revealed that the Shelley land was mortgaged for $500 at 10% interest, and it was near foreclosure. The citizens of Chicago came together and paid off the mortgage, as well as donating an additional $417 to the family. By July of 1896, Kate had applied for several odd jobs, one with the Iowa State Legislature. Her surviving brother, John, actually wound up working for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway for most of his life like his father had. She worked as a second-class school teacher in the early 1900s, and in 1903 the Chicago and Northwestern Railway gave her the job of a station agent at the new Wangona Depot. Apparently there were a lot of suitors for Kate in terms of husbands, but she never married. She chose to live most of her life with her ailing mother and her sister Mary. By 1910, though, her health was on the decline, and on January 12, 1912, she sadly passed away of Bright's disease, otherwise known as acute nephritis, a type of disease affecting the kidneys. She was 49 years old. Still, her memory and legacy has lived on for quite a long time. Between 1955 and 1971, an express train operated by Chicago and Northwestern Railway was known as the Kate Shelley 400. Although the name was officially dropped in 1963, there also exists the Kate Shelley Railroad Museum on the site of the old Montgona Depot. The Shelley family donated a collection of letters and papers of family members of Kate to the Iowa State University, and timetable accidents for Metra's Union Pacific/West Line are actually printed in what's called Kate Shelley Rose Pink. Union Pacific's new bridge, of course, stands today, and the reason why I knew about Kate Shelley growing up, beyond my legitimate interest in trains obviously, was because of Margaret Wetterer, who wrote a children's book called Kate Shelley and the Midnight Express in 1991, which tells a loose version of the story for children. I only found out about the book back then because it was featured in an episode of Reading Rainbow, and it was always one of my favorites. As an author myself, I always appreciate when such amazing stories are put to paper in such a clear way, and it's also part of the reason why I do what I do here. I think it's safe to say that Kate Shelley will never be forgotten for what she did. She was a true hero of the railways, and should always be fondly remembered. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.